So hello, NSU Art Museum Fort Lauderdale members, friends and guests who are joining us this evening. If you don't know, I am Dr. Rocky Ruggiero, and I would like to begin by thanking all of you for joining me for tonight's virtual lecture, which is entitled, What a Difference a Space Makes, Caravaggio and Frank Stella. I would like to thank NSU Art Museum and Director and Chief Curator, Bonnie, who you see here with me, Bonnie Clearwater, who will be participating in this lecture for the opportunity to present this program and for innovative partnerships such as this that bring culture, history, and the humanities from my living room, which you see is a very beautiful living room, directly into yours, which I find an extraordinary opportunity. It is a privilege for me, it is a sincere privilege for me to be with all of you tonight. And in fact, I'll be happy to answer questions. We will be happy to answer questions. Bonnie will be assisting me this evening in that sense by the chat feature. So if you could please, and if you have questions throughout, you can actually write them in and then we'll look it over at the very end. And at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Bonnie Clearwater, who will share a few words before we begin.
Well, thanks, Rocky, and I'm glad to welcome all of you to our live Zoom talk with Dr. Rocky Ruggiero. These have been really, it's been great bringing everybody together through these live Zoom talks. So a number of you have asked me why NSU Art Museum is presenting talks on Renaissance and Baroque art. And we feel it's really important that our audience engages with art from all times and from around the world in order to understand the art of today. It's important. Artists are inspired by the art of the past as much as they are by the art that is of their times. And that goes for Frank Stella as well, who, as many of you know, was featured in a major exhibition we organized in 2017 called Experimentation and Change, Experiment and Change, and it explored the multitude of subjects and art that prompted the many changes of Stella's work from 1958 to 1917. Now, you know, it was really assumed that artists of Frank Stella's post-World War II generation in America had made the definitive break with art of the past. Everything was supposed to be new. But my experience of having worked with many of these artists closely is that they never really did make that break and were greatly, they saw themselves as part of that continuity of art. And this especially goes for Frank Stella, who really startled the art world when he presented an illuminating examination of Caravaggio's paintings in his famous lectures at Harvard University in 1983, which were also published in his book, Working Space. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. I read it over and over again, and I think I got all new ideas out of it reading it the most recent time. Now the enveloping space, now the influence isn't about style or technique. It's the enveloping space we experience in Caravaggio's paintings, which provided a spark that helped Stella resolve the dilemma of pictorial space in abstract painting, which in his opinion had lost much of its vitality by 1970. And it's really important to understand Stella's thoughts about Caravaggio in order to grasp how he got from here in this 1966 mitered maze painting with its encircling stripes of day-glow colors to here in the three-dimensional paintings that are on the left side of the screen that go from 1980 to 1917. Oh, sorry, to 2017. Stella says painters face two problems: what to paint and how to paint it. And I'm no Caravaggio expert, so I've called on my friend Rocky to talk about Caravaggio's extraordinary pictorial space and his legacy, and how it created a spark for Frank Stella's work. So thanks, Rocky, for joining us again tonight, and thank everybody for being with us as well.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you. And again, it is a real privilege and honor for me to be here. NSU Art Museum is one of my favorite venues in which to lecture, whether virtually or in person as well. And I'm actually going to get right into it, everyone, because just like Frank Stella sort of backed up from the 20th century to the beginning of the 17th century, what I want to do is back up a little bit further. And one of the things that Frank Stella said in that book, in that series of lectures, is that painting had to work hard to create its own space and to free itself from architecture. Right? In other words, painting essentially had to work hard to make space a protagonist in painting. And this is a really important concept. One, to be perfectly honest, I'm embarrassed to say I wasn't very much familiar with. And I love when Bonnie writes me asking me to give lectures, because it takes me out of my comfort zone. I'm always so deep in the Renaissance and the medieval period and what have you, that I suddenly have to kind of get my head out of the water and look to see how art, of course, is a much broader chronology than just the Renaissance. So what I want to do is back all the way up to the very beginnings of the sort of conquest of space, which of course begins with the great artist Cimabue and his Madonna and Child painting that you see here, which is in the Uffizi Gallery. This is really the first baby steps that painting takes to essentially create the sense of three-dimensionality and to definitively break with what we call that Byzantine style. So you look at a painting like this, and there's still very much that's Byzantine about it, right? This kind of frozen, almost abstract quality about the art, the stacked perspective of the angels that you see, and this almost Escher-like failed illusion here of that arch, which is meant to go orthogonally into space, but the illusion doesn't work successfully. And the idea essentially that he's trying, and so the idea that these are the first attempts that we have to a sense of a kind of three-dimensionality or spatial dimension in art. Of course, it was Cimabue's student, Giotto, who really does sort of solidify this idea of creating this three-dimensional space. And he does it, like everything else Giotto does, with effortless ease. So what you see in the painting, I'm just gonna go over to one sec, everyone. Trying to mute, but for some reason I can't.
What?
Oh, hold on one sec. Excuse me, I'm just having quick technical difficulty.
Muted.
Okay, perfect. Okay, there we go. With effortless ease, in the sense that now you have these figures who wrap around the throne. And so this notion now of a kind of circularity of space. Space is no longer a plane, which cannot be broken, but instead recedes back. And you see it there with the throne itself. And also in the body of the Virgin Mary, this modeling that you see. So suddenly these figures are starting to occupy a real sense of space. Of course, Giotto was trapped in a medieval world, and oftentimes we are victims of our own time. And as beautiful as Simone Martini's Annunciation is, when I'm reading Frank's words about the notion of altarpieces and how painting essentially was a prisoner almost to these sort of pre-established formats in which it had to be created, for some reason, this is the first painting that came to mind. Where essentially we're looking at a painting that screams Gothic, with its elaborate frame, with its compartmentalization, with this gold background that you see. All of it sort of screams of an art of ornamentation, of art that was meant to be seen as a finite thing. It was almost imprisoned within the very frame in which the painting was created. All of this, of course, came to an end when an artist by the name of Masaccio introduced linear perspective into painting for the first time. And suddenly we can paint through a wall and extend space illusionistically into this third dimension, a real milestone in the history of art. And at the same time, of course, this then allowed the artist to determine how the spectator actually saw his or her artwork. As one of my colleagues once put it, with the advent of linear perspective, it's no longer you looking at the painting, it is now the painting looking at you. based on essentially where the artist put that vanishing point into the scene. And the heir to Masaccio's advent of linear perspective, of course, was this great mid-15th century artist by the name of Fra Lippi. He's this sort of second generation early Renaissance artist. And when you look at a painting like this, Bonnie said what to paint and how to paint it. Well, what to paint was pretty much written in stone for most Renaissance artists, because it really does essentially boil down to the same damn thing over and over again. And that, of course, is your Madonna and Child, your Annunciation, your Assumption, your Ascension, your Entombment, and what have you. There's an almost limited amount of religious subject matter, but how they're painting it is changing dramatically. And if you think about how far we've come in just over a century with Fra Lippi's Madonna and Child, a painting, I've excluded the frame of this painting because the frame is not original, but I think you can all tell there's no way to put any kind of elaborate frame on this or compartmentalizing frame. In the Renaissance, a frame will become a simple border to the painting, right? Still enclosing it, but at the same time, not necessarily organizing the space. Nor do we have gold background. And this is another major development, because the idea is that when you look at a painting with a gold background, the implication is that it's taking place somewhere where the sky is golden in color. And where is the sky golden in color, if not in heaven? When you look at a painting like this, suddenly we have landscape. And the implications of landscape are tremendous, because all of a sudden, if naturalism is a painter's objective, there's no more effective way than rendering something naturalistic than by putting a natural setting in the background. The halo, which of course would become an obstacle for most painters in the 15th century when they're trying to naturalize, because it's not every day that you actually have people with these levitating discs or gold plates screwed into the backs of their heads. But here you see Lippi dealing with it in a very successful way. It's turned in perspective, and it's just so thin and delicate that you almost lose sight. The Virgin Mary, right, who's starting to lose that kind of extraterrestrial quality that characterized Byzantine art. And in fact, I dare say that in this painting, we've gone beyond naturalism and into the bombshell category, because the Virgin Mary is a knockout. Right? And then her solemn beauty contrasted by the three stooges over here on the right-hand side. And while we're talking about space, I want you to all notice the ambiguity of the space that Lippi has created here, because technically speaking, the Virgin Mary is sitting about halfway through that window, right? And that window that's there might just be a kind of thumbing his nose at a contemporary of his by the name of Leon Battista Alberti, this great Renaissance theoretician who said that with the advent of linear perspective, what paintings should be now in the Renaissance are not finite objects of worship, but instead windows into a reality where their laws of physics are identical to our own. And so the notion essentially that we're looking through a window into this other world, and it seems that Lippi gave Alberti his window within the window. It's almost a sort of redundancy that he wanted to include, right? Now, we move on to Leonardo da Vinci, and I'm moving through select artists to sort of watch this evolution of painting. And with Leonardo here in his Annunciation in the Uffizi from 1472, he was 20 years old when he painted this. Leonardo introduced two very important innovations to this concept of space. The first of which is middle ground. And remember this notion of middle ground, because it's going to come back when we get into Caravaggio proper. Before Leonardo came along, paintings essentially consisted of foreground, background, foreground, background. And there was nothing to sort of ease that organic transition between the two levels of space. And the other innovation that Leonardo introduced is called atmospheric perspective. It's kind of curious that in paintings before Leonardo da Vinci, objects in the foreground and in the background were usually seen with equal clarity, which of course is an optical impossibility. So as I often like to describe Leonardo, it's not reproducing what we see, it's reproducing how we see, a much more scientific approach. But Leonardo also, not that long after, about 9 years later, trying to tackle this problem of moving away from what we call isocephalic paintings. It's a big, scary word that simply means that figures are usually placed on a parallel plane to the surface, like you just saw in the Annunciation. And that, of course, lends a certain artificiality to painting. They look like puppets being slid across a stage or what have you. So when you look at an unfinished work here, like his Adoration of the Magi, you notice that Leonardo's kind of tweaked the perspective. We're now looking down on the actual scene. But look how he's arranged this circular composition of figures here. Right? This massive activity that's going on, but all of it kind of engulfed in this darkness. And what that darkness does is to push the foreground of the painting back and to move the background actually forward because it's much lighter. And so suddenly we're getting a sense of space that not only extends into the picture, right, but also in the same way almost out of the picture, because by turning this figure with his back to us, it almost envelops the spectator into the scene. So suddenly we feel like we're filling this part of this kind of circular composition. And this was a major innovation in the history of painting, one that Leonardo really did kind of fulfill in his Last Supper. I always talk about, if this painting had been finished, it would actually look more like the Last Supper than anything else he did. But Frank Stella, in his great series of lectures instead, talks about the Mona Lisa, really marking this kind of milestone moment. And I adore the metaphor that Stella used when trying to describe this new sense of space that Leonardo had created, when he uses these soap bubble kind of metaphor technically, where he imagines this translucent soap bubble that extends from, if you look behind, let me put my little spotlight on for all of you. Okay, if you're new to this, follow my red dot. Okay, my red dot indicates where my cursor is located. But what he imagines is this sort of, a soap bubble essentially extending from the balustrade of the balcony upon which Mona Lisa sits, and that contains and encloses that whole space behind her, the landscape. But then another soap bubble from the same point that extends out encloses Mona Lisa, but also the spectator. We're in the painting. This becomes not something that we are detached from, but something we are part of. And he has this great, Stella has this great description of the painting as this tiny, tidy little package. It's a finite thing. It's not a massive fresco. It's not a huge altarpiece. Instead, it's just this sort of portable little image that allows us to actually enter into this space. It's a much more sophisticated way in which to render it. And of course, it took someone of the sophistication of Leonardo to begin this transformation, a transformation which would continue, at least in the eyes of Frank Stella, in the work of Caravaggio. Right? Because what comes next, if we look at, for instance, Raphael, who of course is one of the most extraordinary painters in history, but who follows this canon of painting, yes, painting away the wall. So when you're standing in the Stanza della Segnatura in the Vatican museums, you get this impression of kind of literally walking into the space that he has created. But that space does not pertain to our reality. It is, in a sense, ornamentational, these colors, this almost supernatural light that he's created inside. It's cold, it's distant, it's formal. It's almost too perfect. And I know being too perfect is a good accusation to have thrown at you. But that's essentially what Raphael represents. In fact, off the record, I'm not the biggest fan subjectively of Raphael's works because he is too sweet. What Vasari described as this dolce stile, this sweet style of Raphael, one that supposedly Caravaggio later claimed he would despise. Then, of course, Michelangelo comes along. And for any of you who heard my last lecture with NSU, we talked about Michelangelo as the first modern painter, because he pretty much did away with all of the conventions that were in fact developed in the 15th century. And so you look at a painting like The Creation of Adam, which takes place in this almost abstract space. And one might justify it by saying, well, wait a second here, it's the creation of Adam, he's up on a hilltop, there's nothing else there. So if we want to use a kind of narrative apology for why this painting looks as abstract as it does, okay, but then how do we justify the abstraction of the space in a much easier scene for him to render in a naturalistic way, which of course is the temptation and expulsion. And you remember from my last lecture when I said Michelangelo's visual interpretation of the Garden of Eden is the 1, 2, 3 boulders and the dead tree stump. Most of Michelangelo's contemporaries, including a Raphael, would have envisioned this kind of tropical paradise with the trees and the birds or what have you. Michelangelo will have none of it because, as you know, Michelangelo sees reality through this myopic lens, and that is his obsession with that male nude form. And in fact, this vision of Michelangelo would reach its apotheosis, when he painted his famous Last Judgment. Right? And Frank Stella's description of just what this spatial reality represents is absolutely fantastic. He talks about Michelangelo blasting away the end wall of the Sistine Chapel. Essentially, and again, think about this, the ceiling itself with all of its architectural framing, the Raphael painting I showed you before, there's a comfort zone to looking at those works. They begin, they end, they're self-contained and what have you. And Frank Stella's description essentially of the Last Judgment was, this is a painting that you don't see. This is a painting that you walk into, because there's no weight, there's no gravity, there's no physics. It's just this mass of floating bodies and musculature. And it really does. He talks about it destabilizing the entire Sistine Chapel, whether the 15th century frescoes on the sidewalls or the very ceiling that Michelangelo painted some 24 years before, because there is no connection in the style of the two. And so all of a sudden, this notion of space no longer being confined to the box, no longer being confined to some pre-designated sort of format. This, of course, right, also examined by another contemporary of Michelangelo, and that is the great Titian, the father, essentially, of Venetian painting. And what we see with Titian's artwork is, in fact, a space that is sort of self-contained. We have here in the Venus of Urbino this green curtain, and that curtain motif is one that would be picked up by Caravaggio later on. It should be noted, by the way, that Caravaggio's first painting teacher was one of Titian's last students, a gentleman by the name of Simone Peterzano. And this is a motif, that kind of curtain backdrop that Caravaggio would pick on. But what Frank Stella mentions in his book is that Venice is sort of a victim of itself because of its emphasis on its superficiality, that is the canvas, and how, of course, they apply their pigment. And so he also talks about the materiality of Venetian art, that without the surface, that rough texture of the canvas surface and the way that pigment is applied, like you see here in Titian's famous Venus blindfolding Cupid in the Borghese Gallery, that this type of painting kind of loses its sense. That space becomes secondary to actually the material and to the surface upon which it's actually created. And you see that in the background of this image. You get this sense of space, but it's a sense of space that is kind of alienating to the spectator, because this isn't real. This is painterly in its very essence. And so Frank Stella then talks about this crisis that occurs. Because what painting, okay, meaning what painting artwork and the artist who produced it could now continue or to stand against, let's say, this extraordinary legacy of artists, which was all kind of near contemporary. In other words, after you've had Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael and Titian, what comes next, or what possibly could follow? Well, many art historians today, of course, talk of the Mannerist crisis that occurs after these artists produced this, Olympus of creation and creativity. Whereas, of course, we get this kind of alienating type of art. But instead, Frank Stella says that the heir apparent to all of this greatness was, in fact, the artist Caravaggio. Right? Now, it is worth mentioning that Caravaggio essentially fell off the face of the earth from about 1700 until the middle of the 20th century. He just fell out of favor. And people forget that artists do go through these trends where essentially one moment they're incredibly popular, the next they are essentially forgotten. And that Caravaggio kind of re-exploded onto the scene in the middle of the 20th century. And what Frank Stella sees in Caravaggio is, in fact, the heir to those great artists that I just mentioned. Now, a lot of people would have difficulty, I think, accepting that, because most would accept Caravaggio as an extraordinary artist, but perhaps would not put him on the same level as a Michelangelo, a Raphael, or a Titian, for that fact, or even a Leonardo, if we're to go that far. And this is what intrigued me about it. And I'm a huge fan. Bonnie knows this, I think, which is why she wanted me to talk about Caravaggio. I just adore his artwork. I adore his outlandish biography as well. And when Bonnie told me, I love that phrase, yeah, what to paint and how to paint it. And again, Caravaggio knew exactly what to paint in the 17th century, because again, the art market was demanding a certain type of iconography in the work that was being created. But it was how he was painting it that was about to change the world. And so Frank Stella makes this parallel between this sort of 20th century crisis of abstraction after the great artists at the beginning, and says it's not that different from that same kind of crisis that happened in Italian art between those great geniuses and the work of Caravaggio. And the place where Caravaggio really sort of explodes onto the scene is in fact his first sort of public commission, which is the paintings in the Contarelli Chapel in the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi, the chapel which at least virtually I am sitting in right now. He got this contract at the beginning of the 17th century, it was 1602, and essentially he's painting scenes having to do with the life of the apostle St. Matthew. And the first of the scenes that he painted was the martyrdom of St. Matthew. Now, this is a striking painting, which anyone, whether you're looking at it in person or seeing it in reproduction, is moved by this sheer drama, right? What one art historian referred to as this living theater. When you look at Caravaggio's paintings, essentially you are seeing something that is very much alive. And that's a comment that Frank Stella made when describing Caravaggio, and that these paintings were alive before they were actually put into the context of this chapel. And that you can take this painting and essentially put it in my living room, and please put it in my living room, or you could take it to the Metropolitan Museum, or we can put it at the NSU Art Museum as well, and it doesn't lose any of its significance. It doesn't have to be in this chapel. And the story here is very simply how St. Matthew, who had established an early Christian community in the North African country of Ethiopia, was assassinated by the king because he essentially protected a young Christian virgin from the advances of this rather seedy king. And so the king sent an assassin to kill St. Matthew. And the story is he actually stabbed him from behind when he was elevating the host. And so this is the scene. But you see that Caravaggio, one, has put it into this kind of, again, self-contained space. It's not quite clear where we are. There seems to be an altar back there. Why these figures are in their loincloths can possibly be explained by this kind of recession in the ground. Is this a baptismal font where they were just a few minutes ago? This mix of contemporary clothing that we have 17th century, this completely unnatural use of light, just renders this sort of timeless and spaceless in the sense that it's not, again, constrained to its particular location. And as I mentioned, Caravaggio, who was a clinical sociopath, by the way, most of what we know about the artist we know from his jail records. And you see him actually including his own self-portrait in the background of the image, presumably as the king who orders the assassination. So what kind of personality are we talking about? Well, one of those personalities essentially where he's rooting for the bad guy in the actual story itself. But the point I also want to make is that as revolutionary as this space was, because there really is nothing against which we can bounce this, either before or soon thereafter in Italian art, he is very much a student of art. And as much as Caravaggio maintained that he despised Renaissance precedents or classical sculptures, that for him, inspiration came from the street, came from the real world, from the brothels and the taverns that he frequented. And this, in fact, was true. He did look at his predecessors. He did look at the great masters from the previous century. This is Raphael's great Transfiguration painting in the Vatican museums. And in fact, if we were to cut this painting off right here, I think you'll see a pretty amazing similarity between his composition and what Raphael does there as well. And that sense of space that Raphael actually creates in his Transfiguration is one that is indebted, of course, in turn to Leonardo's Adoration of the Magi that I showed you before, that sense of circularity and the use of the chiaroscuro, the light and dark, to actually model the space. Not modeling the figures, we're modeling the space using these contrasts of dark and light fields, which is exactly what Caravaggio does over here on the left-hand side. All right? And so the idea that, yes, he is looking at his predecessors for inspiration in these particular works. Then, of course, we have the most celebrated of all the paintings in the chapel, which is the calling of St. Matthew. Right, now, if you look behind me, you'll see the window in the top of the chapel, right? And the painting, which is the reverse, it's over here. Technically, the light in this picture is coming from the direction of the window, but when you're standing in the chapel, they do not line up. The general direction is the same. And then, of course, the paradox being that there's actually a window in the painting, which seems pointless because it's not producing anything at all inside. The calling of St. Matthew is a tricky one, because there really is no story behind this. The gospel account simply says that Christ walks into a room, points at Matthew and says, "Follow me." And Caravaggio turns two words, what to paint and how to paint. And I'm going to keep banging this nail on the head with my hammer. And look what it becomes. It becomes this street scene from 17th century Rome. We're outside one of these grimy palazzi. And those of you who know Rome know, in fact, how accurate a representation this is. Everyone in contemporary dress, these young kind of hoodlum characters, they call them spade. They thought they were tough guys. These young men who'd walk around with swords. And then this supernatural agility of Christ who appears on the right-hand side of the scene, extending that right hand a la Michelangelo in the creation of Adam. So again, looking at his predecessors, and that incredibly graceful gesture then comically mimicked by clumsy, I call him Igor from Frankenstein, Peter, who comes kind of stumbling into the scene and extending his right hand as well. And then it becomes kind of ambiguous as to whom is being called. And that light coming in, and that light in that space, again, becoming a protagonist of the painting, enclosed in the space, but at the same time, the light touching every one of them. But is it touching this guy? Just a little bit more. And so shaping that space with the light that he introduces into the scene. And most of the time, most of us presume that this, in fact, is Matthew, who's simply passing the buck to the gentleman that you see, who's so engrossed in counting his money that he kind of missed the calling that was perhaps aimed at him. Or how about the St. Matthew and the angel? This is the altarpiece. If you look behind me, you'll see it there. The angel in a very risque kind of position there, right? This foreshortening coming down into the scene, essentially ticking off the generations. You read the Gospel of Matthew, it starts in a very kind of tedious way as he goes through and lists all the generations that connected Jesus Christ all the way back to the Old Testament figures of Abraham. I love the scene. I love its simplicity. But again, this notion of space where suddenly we become part of this, right? This object sort of subject relationship changes dramatically. But more than that, it kind of unnerved Caravaggio's contemporaries. After all the landscape, the perspective, the illumination, what have you, to simply prime his canvases in black and then paint on top of that blackness. As Frank Stella describes it so perfectly, the middle ground suddenly becomes the total ground of the painting, because technically Matthew is the foreground, then the middle ground is that blackness, but there's nothing else there. And that blackness extends well beyond the actual frame of the painting proper. Space becomes a protagonist. Now, it is worth mentioning, by the way, that this is actually the second version of the painting. The first was destroyed in the bombing of Berlin in 1945, but portrayed St. Matthew in such an unflattering way that the Contarelli family, the patrons of the chapel, actually asked Caravaggio to produce a second version, which is the one that I just showed you. This instead a black and white photograph of the original. All right. Now, also want to mention that that space that exploded into the 17th century world in the Contarelli chapel, it's not ex nihilo. It's not from nothing. It was a gradual evolution in the work of Caravaggio. And some of his earliest paintings, like his Sic Bacchus, are directly indebted to the compositions of his Venetian predecessors. Remember, Caravaggio's first teacher was the Venetian Simone Peterzano. So this composition of the table and then Bacchus in the middle ground, which is presumably a self-portrait of Caravaggio, and then this kind of neutral background is one that he learned from artists like Bellini. Right? This is his great Madonna and Child in the Met in New York City, where essentially we have the parapet establishing the foreground, Mary, this odd-looking Christ child holding his quince, establishing that middle ground, and then this cloth of honor. But I love how Bellini kind of unveils the illusion by pulling it so that suddenly we have this kind of townscape behind the actual scene. But that parapet figure background is one that would appear over and over in Caravaggio's earlier art. Think of the boy with the basket of fruit. That basket of fruit, which some argue is one of the earliest still lifes in the history of art, occupies that foreground space. The solicitous young boy, and this is the other thing that we love to do with Caravaggio paintings, and that is to become familiar with his models, because he uses the same ones over and over again. So those same people who he encountered in the brothels and the taverns, or he was emotionally involved with, such as Mario Minetti, who is the model for this particular painting, who was Caravaggio's boyfriend in his early days in Rome. He occupies the middle ground with that solicitous glance and the blouse falling over his shoulder, which lends to this homoerotic quality of which Caravaggio is often accused. But look at that background, right? This is not Caravaggio yet. Not the way I described him in the chapel behind me. There is still sense of finite space because there's light bouncing off of it there. So this is the photographer. You know, you go to the professional photographer who puts that backdrop behind you. So it is a process that evolved. It wasn't something that was born immediately. And in fact, again, indebted to Venetian painting. Giorgione's famous La Vecchia, this allegorical image of a woman and the scroll that says with time, but there's that composition now of parapet, figure occupying the middle ground. And look what Giorgione did 100 years before Caravaggio. In fact, oftentimes Caravaggio's innovations in Rome were simply dismissed as being that painter che dipinge come Giorgione. They would say that painter who paints like Giorgione. That's how they would just a priori dismiss the innovations introduced by Caravaggio. But there's much more, because not all of Giorgione's paintings actually looked like this at the time. His Bacchus in the Uffizi, and again, is innovative as the figure is. And in fact, it's the same model that you saw earlier, and how, again, he unveils the illusion. Look how the sheet falls off the mattress, revealing a mattress and not obviously a marble triclinia. A Bacchus with dirty fingernails, who's actually drinking while he models. And, you know, Caravaggio really was the first to work from living models in his studio. And, you know, this is something else that Frank Stella mentions in his examination of Caravaggio, and that is that his studio was a living place, right? Again, this sort of living theater, as I mentioned, where technically there were actors who were acting. Caravaggio essentially capturing them in the particular scene. And we know he's drinking because of the blush in his cheeks and in his hands as well. And then, of course, this illusion of perfection or the classical world is broken with the rotting fruit that he's included in the particular scene. But again, that space not yet evolved fully into that kind of dark dimension that we saw in the Contarelli Chapel. Right? But you see him getting there. And now Caravaggio, this sledgehammer of an image of the Medusa head, which is actually a self-portrait. That's his own face that he's captured on that shield, which, by the way, is a convex surface. And so it projects out even further. But he's starting now to appreciate this immediacy. It's almost as if the figures, Caravaggio's figures, are invading our space. Right? It's no longer this sort of struggle to get into theirs. They're actually intruding into ours. And you see that here with this almost shocking image of Medusa coming out of her pictorial space and into our world. And, you know, again, this is, for me, the most effective way to illustrate what a revolution Caravaggio was. Because the paintings to the left and right here in the Chirazi Chapel were both by Caravaggio, whereas the altarpiece was by no slouch of a painter named Annibale Carracci. Right? And you see the more conventional, Baroque, flowery, ornamentational style. Right? And that sense of space, which is still characterized by a blue sky, something we're familiar with, something that makes us feel comfortable, versus the rather unnerving, shallow foreground spaces that Caravaggio instead used in his work. And the curious thing is that Carracci accused Caravaggio publicly. He said, "What are you hiding in those dark backgrounds? Are there demons?" He actually once challenged Caravaggio to take one of his paintings out into sunlight, into the open space, and say, "Look, let the sunlight expose what it is that you're doing in the background of these particular images." Because I want you to realize that this was unnerving to artistic convention in the beginning of the 17th century. The immediacy, look at this, the crucifixion of St. Peter, and now we're part of it. This is not something that's up on a stage for us. It's like this was happening on the street, and I happen to be walking by, And I'm just standing there entranced at what is actually taking place. And that is this man whose body is familiar to me. This is the body of a fisherman. This is the body of a manual laborer with those nails graphically piercing his hands and his feet. These men who've done this job 100 times. And you see the guy crouching down, pushing it up, pulling with that rope. Look at the shovel. You know, and again, if you've ever done manual labor, you know that's something you do. He's using the shovel almost as leverage to pull himself up. And there's a rawness to the way it's depicted, but that space just imprints it onto our sense of sight, onto our sense almost of real time because of how immediate the scene actually is. And then across from it, we have the conversion of St. Paul. You know, and I joke with my students about this because convention, of course, in 16th century art is that the main subject of a painting occurs in the center of a painting. Well, if that held true, then the center of this painting, or the subject of the painting, excuse me, is the horse, right? And in fact, kind of like the horse's hiney that you see over here on the left-hand side. It's just a different approach to the scene where this dramatically foreshortened figure of St. Paul with his arms outstretched, with the light almost pinning Paul to the ground, almost like he's struggling to get up, but he can't. And just the shallowness of this space that is created by the horse and his groom that you see here as well. It's a completely different approach, a radical way to establish a subject in a radically different sense of spatial composition. Not just for the 17th century, because I think, again, and I empathize with Frank Stella when he's looking at his artwork, at Caravaggio's artwork, because again, today, this seems modern and revolutionary to us as well. Here in the Cavalletti Chapel in the Church of Sant'Agostino, where again, we get this kind of typical, this is actually late 15th, early 16th century embellishment. And I show you the photo because that's the Caravaggio painting, and it looks like it doesn't belong there. It is not a part of that. Fine, here it is close up, and I just adore this painting of the Madonna of Loreto, where she looks like an overworked housewife who's just tired of answering the door every time a couple of pilgrims come to pay homage to her special child. And just like that distant stare of this Roman 17th century matriarch. I mean, this is a woman that Caravaggio knew. This is a child who's a little too old to be playing the role of the Christ child, but perhaps he was the only model that was available. The immediacy, again, of the spaces we're outside. We're at the door of a Roman palazzo. You see the plaster flaking off, revealing the brick underneath, that shadow being cast by her body there to the right-hand side. And then again, the realism of the figures as well. So it is the space, but it's what's in that space that also kind of renders this just a scene. And we're just a bystander who happen to be walking by, watching this taking place, and at the same time become enveloped. It's almost like the space in the painting extends out and encloses us as well, as Frank Stella described that soap bubble metaphor that I described to you earlier. Perhaps the work of art that most resembles, I guess, or most inspired, or whatever the word might be, that three-dimensionality that Bonnie was talking about earlier is in fact Caravaggio's deposition in the Vatican museums, where essentially he's turned it all in this kind of right angle foreshortening, where the stone of unction here is facing us at the corner, as is the elbow of this figure who is taking care of the body of Jesus Christ. The figures themselves, in the sense of almost animation, you see this sequence that he's created of figures bowing down St. John, whose finger is about to slip into Jesus's wound. The older image of the Virgin Mary, which is not quite common. Mary Magdalene, or sorry, Veronica, excuse me, who is engrossed here in her own sorrow with the veil, and then Mary Magdalene with those outstretched arms. And so all of it taking place in a space with very little sense of setting. Yeah, and again, it reminds me very often of, if you remember the scene from Dead Poets Society, when Robin Williams walks in and he pulls out the textbook. I can't remember the author's name he talks about, but the formula that we should use for evaluating poetry, right? The criteria by which we should do it. And you know, when you're coming off the 16th century and the Raphaels, who've pretty much written the book on how art should look, the questions you ask are, who are they? What are they doing? Where is it taking place? We know who they are, even though they're slightly different representations than we're used to seeing. We know what they're doing, but we don't know where they are. And that's an unnerving characteristic of the art. so that, again, this painting doesn't need to be in a church, doesn't need to be in a chapel. This painting can be anywhere. And the moment you're standing, whether it can be New York City or Shanghai, you get pulled in to the actual painting space. And that is an extraordinary characteristic of Caravaggio's work. The Madonna of the Palafreniere. This is one of my absolute favorite paintings by Caravaggio. It's quite large. Was painted for the papal grooms or the butlers whose responsibility it was to tend to the Pope. Caravaggio paints this in 1605. So you can see it now, the space evolving. This is after the Contarelli Chapel. So the idea that now what started in the chapel behind me has now become a kind of standard part of his paintings. With this ambiguous sense of background, but we don't need the background because the actors have kind of established the space, and the action actually gives identity to the painting. And what you have is an image of the Virgin Mary, the Christ child, and then Saint Anne, who's Jesus's grandmother, the Virgin Mary's mom. A painting which was actually put in the chapel of the papal grooms in St. Peter's Basilica. So if your painting is on display in St. Peter's, you are now the creme de la creme of artistry in the city of Rome. Well, it remained there for a full 2 weeks and was then removed because the painting was considered indecorous. And what is it that's indecorous about this painting? Well, as far as I know, that's the first monumental representation of the Virgin Mary's cleavage that you'll see in the history of art. Not to mention the fact that the model for the Virgin Mary was a very public prostitute, or courtesan, as they called them at the time, or the fact that technically this was seen to be a little bit inappropriate, as direct a metaphor as it is for Mary to be, squishing the head of the snake and evil, therefore, to be doing so with a bare foot. And I know, it almost seems like Victorian society where seeing a woman's barefoot is pornographic or what have you. But again, we are talking about St. Peter's, and we are talking about an artist who had a pretty scandalous reputation. So it may have actually been taken the wrong way. But what I adore most about this is the invisible protagonist, which is the light. God, the Father. So Dad is in the painting as well. And Dad is in the painting in the form of light that comes in and falls upon this Christ child that you see in an incredibly beautiful way. And that's the thing with Caravaggio. It's this mix between the absurdly almost vulgar, in the true sense of vulgar, and earthy, dirty fingernail kind of artist, and instead poetry, visual poetry, and all of it again encased in these kind of theatrical spaces that then engulf us. Yeah, in fact, Frank Stella had this other great metaphor where he talked about the actors. It's almost like being in a theater and the actors come off the stage, which has become kind of convention since 1983 when he wrote gave the lectures. But it's true. I mean, it feels like these figures step out into our world. And when you stop looking at a Caravaggio painting, and Rome, I adore Rome. It's my favorite city in Italy. You do. When you walk in the streets, you're looking around, hoping to see them. I'm hoping to see that woman. I'm hoping to see that kid, because you know that they are living actors that Caravaggio has actually created. Right? His Saint Jerome. This is in the same room, excuse me, of the Borghese Gallery. And it's my absolute favorite painting by Caravaggio, surprisingly, because there's not that much sex, violence, or rock and roll in this particular painting. And it's Jerome, the author of the Vulgate, patron saint of scholars. It's as simple as can be. There are 3 colors in the painting, pretty much red, white, and black. There's no background, so this is that typical now revolutionary Caravaggio space. But every time I talked about this painting, even before I read Frank Stella's lectures about Caravaggio, what I always imagined was St. Jerome waking up and just grabbing the bedspread, which is the red thing you see here, and just wrapping himself up in it, shuffling over to the table, plopping down on a stool, grabbing the book, and you see he brings it really close to his eyes because advanced age has made seeing difficult. That automatic gesture, he doesn't even look at the inkwell into which he dips his stylus because he's done this so many times. It's automatic. It's unconscious, the gesture, and how close he comes to flirting with the skull that sits there as well. This memento mori, how close he comes to his own mortality, technically in the image. Wait, what? All that just from this? Yeah, and that's the amazing thing about it. I see the bed. The bed is not in the painting, but I see the bed. And I see St. Jerome's sort of daily routine, and I can see it because of the space in which Caravaggio actually encloses the entirety of it. It's absolutely extraordinary in its simplicity, in its effectiveness. and its acuteness. I mean, there's an acuteness to the space that he creates as well. And then, painting that's here in the United States at the Met, and that is The Denial of Peter. And Frank Stella, in his essays, mentions too that this close-up, this primo piano, which was radical for the time. Artists weren't really doing this. Really up close, you see Peter here denying Christ, and this little play where the soldier accuses him, and that's one denial. The woman accuses him, that's two denial. And then she accuses him again, and that's three denials, or fulfilling Christ's prophecy that he would. And they're standing in this kind of ambiguous fireplace that you see. And you see, again, the rapid rendering and brushstroke that Caravaggio uses to produce it. Well, believe it or not, that kind of primo piano was already very much present in the work of an artist who was painting 300 years before Caravaggio, and his name was Giotto. Okay. And it's worth mentioning because that's the comment. The comment that Frank Stella made about Caravaggio is one that I've been making about Giotto for years. And that is this immediacy of a close-up, which is something that, again, has become almost commonplace now in film, in cinematography, but one that began, you see the date here, this is 300 years before Giotto, and this idea of sort of closing up, and clearly this kind of immediacy that both Giotto and Caravaggio used was one that was very much appreciated in modern cinematography, and you see it here in the parallel that I make to a 20th century movie. Right? And so obviously these innovations are not limited necessarily to a pictorial space, but to cinematic space as well. All right? And then finally, and I'll finish off here with David and the Head of Goliath. And, and as I was reading Frank Stella's words describing how that middle ground becomes total ground and how that middle ground then extends out beyond the picture space, this was the painting that immediately came into my mind. I just adore Caravaggio's image of David emerging from that darkness, emerging from that space, and with that dramatically foreshortened left arm holding out the disembodied head of Goliath, which is actually a self-portrait of Caravaggio himself. And so what I adore most about this is that this is the image outside of the context of his biography and the nefarious dealings that went on, the murder of a man in 1606, it's Caravaggio emerging from this extraordinary space that he himself had created at the beginning of the 17th century. Okay, so with that, I'm going to close off and open up to questions, and Bonnie's actually going to join me in answering these questions because I just have a blast doing it with her. I think it's going to be great. So please feel free to chime in with questions if you should have them, and we'll be taking them both off the chat or off the Q&A. Okay, here we go. So Bonnie, can you see, if you open up the Q&A, can you see the questions?
No.
Okay,
I'm gonna.
There's a Q.
Oh, I got it. That's one for you.
Perfect. Okay, just making sure you can see it. So it said, I've heard that Caravaggio influenced Rembrandt through pictures that Rembrandt saw. Could you speak about that? Yes, there is a direct connection between Caravaggio and Rembrandt, particularly in this style, this tenebroso style, this tenebrism as we call it, where essentially it is light kind of shaping figures out of this deep shadow. And again, prints were circulating largely throughout Europe, reproductions of paintings. So Rembrandt didn't have to go to Rome to see Caravaggio. He could have seen Caravaggio back in the Netherlands just as easy. So yes, there's a direct connection between the two. And then Bonnie, I don't know if you see the next question. What was the title of the Frank Stella book I'm referring to?
Yeah, it's called Working Space.
I'm holding it, but you can't see it because of my virtual background.
It's Working Space.
Working Space. And Bonnie, I have to thank you because I didn't know about this. You're the one who brought this to my attention, and it's absolutely fantastic. Absolutely.
Yeah, it truly, and it's amazing. I've done 2 major exhibitions with Stella, and I think he's an artist that someone said who's my favorite artist. And I have to say, I could be working on Stella for the rest of my life and still feel like there's still more to mine.
Wow.
And just going back to reading Working Space in conjunction with this talk, I saw things I hadn't seen it before in it, and made so much sense after having done the last exhibition in 2017 with him. And I absolutely love, you hit on a lot of the same things that I picked up this time, and that idea of the bubble going around Leonardo's Mona Lisa. It was, I just saw the Mona Lisa in a whole other way. And I think that that's another thing that Stella does in his writings, is that he brings a whole other perspective. At least for me, I don't know if it does it for you, who knows this work so well, the Caravaggio so well, and the Renaissance so well. But I saw things and that I just hadn't really thought about before in that way.
Yeah, it's amazing to see it through his eyes. We have a question. So how do we see the influence of Caravaggio on Stella's work? Okay, now, the impression that I get is pretty much what I'm looking at behind you, right? I mean, that transition from the two-dimension to the three-dimensional that you see, and that Caravaggio, and again, correct me, Bonnie, but Caravaggio sort of presenting Stella with a potential solution to how to move out of that two-dimensional world.
Right, and right behind me, we have two examples from his Protractor series, and then from his Scarlatti series. And another misunderstanding of Stella, and I think a lot of the artists of his generation, is that their work was trying to get rid of all sense of pictorial illusion and to emphasize the flatness of the picture plane. That was the narrative that ran it, particularly in American painting, greatly influenced by the critic Clement Greenberg. And Stella never was looking to get rid of space from painting, but he wanted to eliminate the Renaissance one-point perspective, which is fake. That is not the way we see. And then the other kind of space that was occurring was the push-pull that particularly is associated with the Hans Hofmann school of painting, that you put one color, one form next to each other, and there's this, all of a sudden, this plastic relationship that occurs in abstract painting. So Stella was looking at, and he felt that what had happened by 1970 was this thrust to try to find the essence of painting, which was basically pigment on a flat surface, had really turned into, and I love the word he used, illustration. And it wasn't illustration as we think of illustration, but illustrating this theory of art, of painting heading to this flatness. And for Stella, that just wasn't exciting. He really, in the sense of the Caravaggio, what I just learned from working with Stella is that the work of the past he gets this jolt from it. And it's that jolt that these artists are able to produce in him, that he sets the high bar for what he wants to achieve. And he saw how Caravaggio has created this space that truly is palpable, and I think a lot of it comes from Bernard Berenson, because he described Giotto in the same way, as this idea of the space coming out. Right. And that's what was exciting. And it's interesting, my work on Mark Rothko as well, the tactile, the idea of a space being something that you can feel, that you can habit, that it hits you in the gut. And that's where the emotion comes from, is the tactile. And the other thing I really loved about what Stella wrote in Working Spaces was that before Caravaggio, we know that the figures are in the round, but it's as if they're cutouts and flat and pasted to the surface. But and I'm going to switch my background. Let's go to the Moby Dick series that's on the left-hand side of the screen. you could see how the form has, a lot of people don't want to classify this as sculpture. This is a three-dimensional painting. He has done what Caravaggio did on a flat surface. Stella realized he didn't want any illusion, and the only way you can avoid that illusion was to make your painting actually three-dimensional and coming out to the space. And the other thing that, with Caravaggio, the feeling that there is actually a back to all the figures, which was exciting. They were no longer these flat silhouette cutouts that are arranged on the surface, but there is this space that's all around the figures. And in this particular work that's behind me, you could see the evolution of his thinking about it, in that the back of the shapes are all painted. So not only, painting is a frontal experience, but with these works from 1980 on, it really is about the painting existing in our space, and we're part of it. And that's what I feel he got from Caravaggio, is this idea that we are there, we're in that space.
Perfect. I have another question here in the chat. It says, was Caravaggio gay, and how would Caravaggio represent himself in our times? From what we know of his biography, Caravaggio was probably bisexual. We hear of romantic interest with both men and women. And how would he represent himself in our times? That's a tough question. I mean, one thing, he does like to put himself in his paintings. And so he sort of, in fact, Frank Stella picks up on this in the sort of, Fellini, Quentin Tarantino, Alfred Hitchcock kind of cameo in their own movies, and that he would do the same thing in his painting. I'm not sure how he would represent himself today. That's a tough question to answer. And then let's see, we have another one. I also see the use of pure white with Sargent. Was he inspired by Caravaggio? I imagine, but again, I don't know enough about John Singer Sargent to answer that definitively, but I do imagine Sargent, particularly since he was so influenced by Italian art, that would have looked at and appreciated that use of pure white that he saw in Caravaggio.
Rocky, why did Caravaggio slip out of favor? He doesn't reemerge again until 19th century or 20th century?
20th century. I think it's
20th century.
1959, I believe, is when they put on the first kind of monograph exhibit on Caravaggio. And it was what's his name? Mahone, Sir Dennis Mahone. It's this British, well, actually, that's not true. There was an Italian by the name of Venturi who kind of started looking at Caravaggio again, and then Mahone picked up on it. But Mahone took Caravaggio out of Italy. And I think that's what really put him on the map again. Personally, Bonnie, I think it's because of the whole French Academy. And the fact that they're looking at Raphael as the poster boy for what art should be, with the strict rules, and the fact that you could sort of extrapolate a clear definition of what balanced and art can be, and that Caravaggio just really, if you think about it, there's, aside from the theatricality of his paintings and the chronology of when he was active, he doesn't really fit into that kind of Baroque box the way his contemporaries did, whether it's Guercino or Carracci himself. That's essentially the more kind of mainstream Baroque style of art that was being produced at the time. And so I just think that there was no appeal to those French academic painters in Caravaggio. And so he just slipped out. Botticelli as well. I mean, Botticelli made a big comeback in the 20th century also, which I find shocking. I mean, for me, Caravaggio is just the be all and end all. And I love showing Caravaggio to my students at the end, after we've seen it all, the Michelangelo and that's like, I mean, it hits you so hard. And like, that word, the palpable, it's a palpable type of art that he actually creates. Okay.
I think, for me, when Frank Stella did the lectures in '83, that did a lot to bring attention to Caravaggio, particularly in the contemporary art field. That there was this sense of not paying much attention to art history, and then all of a sudden there was this great interest in Caravaggio.
It was great to see Caravaggio through Frank Stella's eyes. And again, I always joke about this because as art historians, I've always said that we're sort of frustrated artists, that I wish I had the talent to actually produce it. So inevitably we hide behind our eye, right? Our critique or what have you. So to actually see a Caravaggio through the eyes of an artist of the caliber of a Frank Stella, that's an extraordinary thing. And I think you're right. I think most of us imagine that, contemporary artists in general are just dismissive of the past. And it's great to see, obviously, that it's couldn't be farther from the truth with the work of Frank.
And Rocky, did you, in looking at Stella's work, see the spark of Caravaggio?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the beauty of it. It's like looking at it, it's sort of clear as day. And in fact, the point you just made, Bonnie, about painting the back, it's extraordinary. If you think about it, it's such a simple thing, but it really just then, it's the same kind of thing. It's just, the connection's as clear as day when you actually think about it. I would never have made the connection beforehand. Knowing Frank Stella's work, but not knowing those lectures, I would not have associated that with Caravaggio. And then to actually have Frank Stella say that it was Caravaggio that sort of gave him that spark is even more fulfilling technically from an art historical perspective.
And I think it really does explain how did he get from the minimal, which I never think of minimal, because he certainly does seem to, let's get back to, it seems to me he gets more stripes and more color in this painting. It's not minimal at all, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Bonnie, I'm just going to answer one more. So which biography on Caravaggio would I recommend? If you're a beginner to Caravaggio, then I would look for a book which I think is out of print. And it's written by an author named Howard Hibbard, Hibbard, who wrote a series of biographies on great artists like Michelangelo, Bernini, and Caravaggio. It's an easy read. It reads like a narrative. And that's a good intro. And then write me and I'll give you a series of other books you can read after, which get a little more.
Oh, here's a fun fact. I studied with Howard Hibbard, Renaissance art in at Columbia.
Wow. I mean, Hibbard's fantastic. I used his Michelangelo biography up until not that long ago, and it became so difficult for my students to find that I then kind of moved on. But I love it. I just think it's such a great read, and the way he really just makes it relevant. It's a rare talent.
That's great. Well, you're a rare talent, Rocky.
Oh,
it's great that you step up to these challenges that I throw out at you in rather quick time. And I know that from the response we get from our audience, people really appreciate what you're able to share and focus our attention on these works. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It's always a pleasure,
we do feel like, my husband and I have been watching your webinars. We took your trip, your virtual trip into Florence, and it really does make it feel like we're together as opposed to being isolated at this time.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It really is. It's great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bonnie, for having me. And thank you all for taking the time out to listen as well.
Okay.
Buonasera, everyone. Bye-bye.
Buonasera.